it is, I mean, that goes both ways. That one actually goes very much both ways in terms of a thing here, because if you're acting in a crisis and you're submitting things hastily that suggest one thing one way and one thing another, you've got to be able to challenge both of them, actually. So, what does happen when scientists disagree? This piece from Persuasion caught my eyes, and again, it's a little older, but I think it's actually worth a read through, because one of the things that gets portrayed is, everything happens by consensus, and that's not entirely true here, because with the right arguments and things corresponding to reality, scientists do coalesce around that ultimately. But it's not a whole bunch of people who decide what that consensus is necessarily. There's disagreement, and particularly in things that are fast evolving. And this comes to us from Persuasion on Substack, and I think it's worth having a good look at. Let's see. January 1976, there was a small outbreak of swine flu among Army recruits at Fort Dix, New Jersey. One soldier died. The United States had not experienced a swine flu outbreak since 1918-1919, and the possibility of another pandemic raised alarm. Amid uncertainty over the severity of the virus, the Center for Disease Control initially recommended the production of a vaccine, but not its administration. The CDC director, however, was persuaded of the need for a mass immunization program. He conducted a telephone poll of committee members to ensure they would not oppose the recommendation that all citizens be immunized within 3 months. Once he gained their assent, his action memo was quickly accepted by President Gerald Ford. By the end of the year, 40 million Americans had been vaccinated at a cost of $135 million. But the pandemic never materialized. Worse yet, the vaccine turned out to be associated with an increased risk of Guillain-Barré syndrome. The incident was widely regarded as a fiasco. The swine flu affair shook trust in public health initiatives for years to come. A post-mortem report concluded that scientists were overconfident and that dissent within the committee had been suppressed in the name of consensus. The president and Congress had pushed forward with the program without investigating the doubts of the scientists within the CDC. And this is a problem. If dissent is suppressed, it is a problem. Undoubtedly, because it doesn't lead to any good things happening. No challenging of if you have a majority viewpoint and the dissent is not allowed to be challenged in any way, shape, or form, the dissent is not allowed to challenge that, I should say, in any way, shape, or form. What do you end up with? You end up with groupthink and not being able to see the flaws in argumentation that may exist, and sometimes to incredibly deadly effect, as it were. Guillain-Barré syndrome is nothing to sniff at, as I understand it. I do not have it. I do not know somebody who has it, but it's my understanding that it's a pretty nasty syndrome. It was a heck of a screw up from history, from the history books with the swine flu thing in the 70s. And you think we would have learned from that, but not necessarily so, it seems. But dissent is extremely important to have, and it's one of the reasons to talk about it is you can have those competing perspectives to help you get at the truth. And that's one of the things I keep going on with this about, is you have to have dissent to get at the truth. You have to push back, and this is why I can't stand postmodernist woke DEI stuff, because it doesn't allow for a whole lot of dissent in anything. So let us continue. The swine flu debacle should have been a chance to learn from mistakes, but in the age of COVID, we're still struggling to deal with dissent in scientific advice. Many facts about the pandemic have been subject to scientific disagreement. We've seen disputes over the virus's mode of transmission, its risk to different demographics, the effectiveness of masks, and the utility of lockdowns. Yet scientific advisors have repeatedly presented their guidance without acknowledging uncertainty within their ranks, only to reverse their position a few months later. Masks were ineffective in February, but mandatory in April. The lab origin hypothesis was a crazy conspiracy theory at first, but became difficult to dismiss 6 months later. School closures were absolutely necessary, then completely unreasonable, then necessary again. Mask mandates in schools have become the latest arena of controversy. The scientific community has been incredibly successful in developing vaccines, but it's still struggling with communicating disagreement. There is something to be said, because if you're talking about good scientific process and good arguing to get at the truth, not the ad hominems of insults and cancel culture and what have you, but disagreement is a pretty normal thing when you're talking about particularly something that is new, that people are investigating, or something that's controversial. You can have a lot of disagreeing viewpoints on something in the sciences with regard to how does it physically work. Does it work this way? Does it work that way? What's the best way to model this thing or that thing? Or, what's the forecast here and why are we making it that way? Or what do we think will happen in this situation? There is some disagreement in those kinds of things, and that shouldn't be ignored. And miscommunicating the uncertainty around the expert judgment, if you will, of scientists is really actually kind of important, because you do run the risk, if you don't, of presenting an overconfidence, and then people do wonder why you're switching targets like a few times later. You do wonder why you get into contradictions and what have you. Scientific work done well is, you're the ultimate skeptic of just about everything. And this is again why I ask so many questions about the DEI stuff, and whether it's decolonizing chemistry curriculum or what have you, because they need to have questions asked of them that are more so in depth than in other places, but also to get at the truth. Is this thing really good? And no, it's not. Let's just put it that way. That's my opinion on it right now, based on the read of the data. It is woke nonsense that will tear things apart at this point, and so I'm not for it. But that's a whole other thing. But he makes a good point here. He's talking about COVID, but suppressing dissent is a really bad idea. If only because you can undermine all sorts of things. If we want to fix this problem, we need to think harder about alternatives to suppressing dissent. Scientific disagreements will surface in public debates sooner or later. Indeed, it will happen, and particularly right now with social media. Twitter, Facebook, Getter, Odyssey, YouTube, the whole works. You can get your scientists are getting smart about that, and particularly my generation and younger with scientists. You can get out there on YouTube and put your disagreement with something out there on YouTube. Lord only knows I have. On YouTube, on Twitter, on Facebook, and all the rest. And, it's going to get out there in public purview that way. And if you're known to the public, for example, you might have that blue check mark next to your name on Twitter or something like that and be a scientist. And if you put out something that's a little different from what's kind of mainstream narrative, if you will, that's scientific dissent right there open in the public. And it shouldn't be silenced. In failing to address them, we risk confusion, distrust, and conspiracy theories, which can seriously undermine public health initiatives. Public health's not the only one where this would be the case. This could be true in just about any situation where you're talking about a major scientific achievement or technological development, or where science is involved or needed with regards to policy making. Because there's a significant amount of times where science is a critical component. Scientific research or expert analysis of some kind is critical to making the policy arrangement. But, you can't have a lack of... You can't just suppress the dissent and expect it not to get out at that point. But this is also a missed opportunity to invigorate the democratic process. Open debate can subject the hidden assumptions in scientific advice to proper scrutiny, lead to better decisions, and prevent mistakes. It can help citizens question scientific claims without accepting or rejecting them wholesale, and it can allow opposition parties to present informed alternatives to government policies and hold decision makers accountable. Let's see. In a series of articles written in the 1960s and 70s, physicist Arthur Kantrowitz, developed a proposal for a new institution to deal with scientific controversies in policymaking. Interesting, I didn't know about that. Kantrowitz complained that competing experts made contradictory technical claims which did not get challenged in the public sphere. This left the public in confusion, weakened the scientific basis of public policy, and heightened mistrust of experts. His solution was to create an adversarial institution where experts would defend their case and then cross-examine each other in front of a panel of impartial scientist judges. The judges would offer a verdict on the disputed scientific points and highlight the agreement between the two sides. The proceedings would be open to the public, and the decision would serve an advisory role for Congress and the president. That's interesting. Okay, wait a second. Because I've heard this put forward, and I want to say it was actually Roger Pielke, or I may be completely wrong, and I'm sorry if that's the case with that one. But what has been put forward in the past as related to climate change policy in particular was something called the red party, blue party kind of thing. And it was unintentionally the colors of the political parties. That was not the point. But the point was something like this, where you would have the adversarial things arguing back and forth in open conversation. And I think actually the reason why people argued against it was they argued it would make it would make the public mistrust scientists more to see this kind of debate out in the open in public. And I don't think I don't know that that's necessarily true anymore. I actually think it might be really informative if it's not a political debate, for one thing, where you're just trying to score points, but where you're actually having demonstrated logical argumentation. I think some folks would actually get into that and actually be interested in hearing it. But, and I don't think it would necessarily cause distrust, because you'd actually be able to see how they work in the scientific process, not how they work in the political debate stage. But that's a whole other thing. But I do remember that. Red Party, Blue Party, or something like that. I forget the exact name of it or what it was called online, but I remember hearing about that a few years ago. It's been brought back up recently, I know that. Though the plan was never realized, Kantrowitz was on to something. To improve how we deal with dissent, we need better institutions to host it in the first place. I have proposed that we revive Kantrowitz's Science Court today, but in a less elitist and more participatory form. Okay, I'm game. I actually haven't read this article all the way through, so I have no idea. A jury made up of competing experts. Let's see. New Science Court would address policy questions with a scientific component. Competing experts would make the case for different sides of the issue, followed by a period of cross-examination. A jury made up of randomly selected citizens, instead of Kantrowitz's scientist judges, would deliberate on the policy question, test the implications of the experts' views against their own values and priorities, and then deliver a policy recommendation. The court could take up questions such as whether to adopt strict lockdowns, whether to keep schools open, and whether to institute or lift vaccine and mask mandates. I don't know what I think of that. Let me read a little bit more first. The goal of the court would be to normalize scientific disagreement in front of a public audience and facilitate critical scrutiny of expertise by non-experts. The adversarial structure would reveal the assumptions and value judgments of each view, while clarifying their level of uncertainty and the scope of disagreement. Scientist jurors would deliberate amongst themselves and reach a decision. This would avoid the imbalance in expertise, which occurs when lay people debate scientists directly, placing citizens in the seat of judgment. The court would solve a number of problems. It would make up for the democratic deficit involved in deferring to unexamined expert opinion, while overcoming some of the shortcomings of uninformed public opinion. It would stop citizens feeling left out of decisions that affect their everyday lives, boosting the democratic legitimacy of policies. It would foster public understanding of the science behind those policies, as complex findings would be translated for non-expert jurors. That could prevent conspiracy mongering and enable a higher level of public discourse going forward. Finally, it would force scientists to engage publicly with both with non-expert citizens and with their peers in the scientific community. Such a process could improve their reasoning, exposing holes in their logic and hidden moral assumptions in their calculations. At its best, the science court would benefit both scientists and lay people. It's an interesting idea, actually. And I hadn't read it all the way through, as I said, so it's very interesting. The The trick would be making sure folks don't treat it like jury duty, or treat it like something they just have to sit through. You'd have to get people who are really interested and wanted to be invested in that decision, I think. Or people who do have a vested decision doing that right, but are looking for the best kind of policy. And you may also have to see, because citizens are so polarized in some of these things now too, that you'd have to get people who are willing to be open-minded at the same time. But I do think it would actually be helpful, and I appreciate the non-elitist language here, because that is the danger of having it be scientists judges, is that there's a very some fields, there's a very small pool of those scientists, and they can all end up being sucked into the same group thing. So I actually think in a way this would be really, really helpful. I could see some problems with it in terms of getting people involved and invested in it, and also making sure you can actually on the fly translate expert lingo for non-experts, which is not always easy to do. And well, this is how you know it's a real expert right here. This is how you know it's a real expert. They can translate this stuff to the layman. They can translate this stuff to somebody who's not an expert and have it come out in a way that they will understand exactly what it is that you're telling them. And they will avoid using jargon, for that matter. Let's see. That's a fascinating idea. New institution is only one part of the solution to the challenge of scientific dissent. The science court can enable more careful scrutiny of different points of view, but its decisions would be one input into public debate and decision-making. Arguments among scientists would necessarily spill beyond the boundaries of the court, and scientists who differ from the official position may want to be heard in other venues. Thinking more broadly about expressions of scientific dissent in the public sphere is therefore vital too, and how the experience of COVID offers valuable lessons on what productive dissent might look like and how it could go wrong. First lesson for dissenters is not to be too hasty. It may be tempting to think that the urgency of a crisis justifies challenging government advice based on quick findings. But the pressure to act quickly is all the more reason to submit findings to careful scrutiny first. Failure to do so risks spreading misinformation and delegitimizing valid disagreement. I would also say the same thing for those who agree with the government advice. That goes both ways. That one actually goes very much both ways in terms of a thing here, because if you're acting in a crisis and you're submitting things hastily that suggest one thing one way and one thing another, you've got to be able to challenge both of them, actually. That would be something I would say in that kind of thing. Second lesson is for dissenters to be upfront about their value judgments. Scientific advice always involves trade-offs about those who need to prioritize, and democratic scrutiny is necessary for exposing these. But if scientists themselves dress up their moral judgments as scientific facts, this only muddies the waters. Again, not just dissenters. Not just people who are dissenting from the policy. Moral judgments as scientific facts. Yeah, you got to be careful watching for that either way. This is something that could be just generally applied, not just to dissenters, but to anybody who's proposing a policy thing based on a scientific results, or scientific analysis or expert opinion. Yeah, you need to be careful and mindful about what your value judgments are if you're doing that. Because remember, scientific process itself doesn't give you anybody a moral compass. That comes from you in your own head. But it can influence things if we're not careful. What we strive for, of course, is that you're not using that. We strive for the unbiased process. Of course, we're not perfect about it, but you strive for the unbiased process, and you have to be mindful of what moral things in there could be influencing the way you're thinking about it. And that's not just for dissenters, people dissenting, that's just scientists in general. The third lesson for dissenters is to enable debate first and point score later. Dissenters themselves can turn out to be wrong. They too must open themselves up for public scrutiny. The role is not to set themselves up as the true authority, but to contribute to an ongoing discussion. The science court would be a key institutional venue for such process, but we can look to other institutions for guidance too. I'm going to say it again. That cuts both ways. Those three things actually cut both ways with this. Because if you're not allowed to have dissent to begin with, if the mainstream or the consensus position or whatever it is doesn't allow dissent either, in here doesn't open themselves up to public scrutiny, then can't even have it with the dissenting opinions either. So this is fascinating. But I kind of think that a lot of what he's saying here doesn't just apply to what a lot of what the author is saying here, doesn't just apply to anybody dissenting or trying to have scientific dissent. It applies very much so to scientists getting into debate to begin with, to be perfectly honest. Let's see. So, COVID has shown we need to get better at questioning orthodoxy productively. Indeed, suppression of scientific debate provokes suspicion, constrains policy, and prevents democratic deliberation. If open disagreement risks creating confusion, too, the damage of a cover-up is worse. Trust takes a long time to build, but can be destroyed instantly. Oh God, yes, we know that. Working out how to improve the relationship between science, democracy, and disagreement through new institutions like the Science Court goes far beyond COVID. Our societies will soon face a vast array of challenges, from the risk of further pandemics and climate change to the ethical dilemmas presented by powerful new technologies like gene editing and artificial intelligence. Now more than ever, we need to learn how to live with and offer productive dissent. Indeed, actually, I agree with that, but it's not just productive dissent, it's productive debate, productive discussion. Because if it's just about dissent being productive, that's not helpful. It has to be productive debate and discussion here, where you actually have the different viewpoints engaging in debate. But I don't think that necessarily happens right now. Alrighty, that's it for this one. Let me know what you think. Like the button, hit the like button on the way out the door. Comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that good jazz, and don't forget to pop on over to Locals and join us where you have fun times over there. Until next time, I'm Adrian. I hope you stay curious.